The rope was a dry, rasping thing against her wrists. It bit into her skin, not with the sharp pain of a new wound, but with the dull, grinding ache of an old one. Dust, fine as ground meal, settled in her hair, on her shoulders, in the creases of her chapped lips. It was the color of everything, the color of the world. She stood tied to the hitching post in the center of what passed for a town square. It was less a square and more a wide, open wound in the road, bracketed by false-fronted buildings that slumped like tired old men. The sun was a hammer, beating down on her head, bleaching the last of the color from her ragged dress. Men watched, some from the shaded porch of the general store, others from the gaping maw of the saloon. Their eyes slid over her, valuing, discarding. She was a piece of unfortunate stock, a lame horse, a broken wagon wheel. Their judgment was a physical weight heavier than the sun. Women watched too from behind twitching curtains. Their gazes were sharper, somehow crueler. They saw not a misfortune, but a threat or a shame. She kept her own eyes fixed on a loose board in the saloon's boardwalk, counting the splinters. 1, 2, 3. If she could just count the splinters, she might not break. The man who had put her there, Brant, leaned against the post beside her, puffing out his chest. He was a man built of soft pride and loud pronouncements. He gestured to her as he spoke to the gathered onlookers, his voice slick with false injury. He spoke of defiance, of ingratitude. He had paid a good price for her, he said, a bride price for a woman who turned out to be as barren and stubborn as the cursed land she came from. Now she was worth less than nothing, an object lesson. She did not hear the words, not really. She heard only the tone, the greasy self-pity, the ownership. Her silence was the only thing left that was hers. It was a small, hard stone she held under her tongue. They could not take it. The crowd murmured, a low hum of agreement and mild entertainment. A spit of tobacco juice landed in the dust near her bare feet. The small splash was a violation. She flinched, a tiny, inward tremor, but her face remained a mask of hardened clay. Then interest began to wane. The sun was hot. The spectacle was growing old. Men turned back to their drinks, women let their curtains fall. The world was forgetting her already, leaving her to bake and fray at the edge of their notice. He was there the whole time, leaning against the farrier's wall, half in shadow, half in the blistering light. He was a tall man, thin as a fence rail, wrapped in a duster the color of the road. Dust clung to him not as a temporary coating, but as if it were a part of his skin, grown there over years of wind and sorrow. His hat was pulled low, shadowing a face that looked as if it had been carved from weathered pine. He did not stare at her like the others. His gaze was different. It was a quiet, steady thing, like the gaze of a hawk assessing the lay of the land. He was not looking at a woman tied to a post. He was looking at the rope. He was looking at the sun. He was looking at the way her shoulders hunched, trying to make herself small enough to disappear. Silas carried whole winters in his eyes. He had seen this kind of casual cruelty before. It was a weed that grew in the thin soil of desperate places. He had watched Brant preen and posture, had heard the lies spill from his mouth, thick and spoiled like bad milk. He knew Brant, knew the rot that lived under the man's polished boots and cheap cologne. He pushed himself off the wall. The movement was slow, deliberate, drawing no attention. He crossed the dusty expanse, his boots making no sound. He stopped not in front of Brant, but to the side, his focus on the store owner who was sweeping dust from one patch of porch to another. Brant's voice faltered. He turned, a flicker of annoyance on his face at the interruption of his audience of one. "Silas," he said, his tone shifting from pompous to cautious. Silas ignored him. His eyes were on the store owner. "He still owe you for that seed." The store owner stopped sweeping, leaned on his broom. "And the barrel of nails. And the whiskey." Silas nodded slowly. He looked at Brant, a long, unblinking stare that seemed to measure the man's soul and find it wanting. Then his gaze shifted to the woman. For the first time, he looked directly at her, and in that fleeting glance, she felt not pity, not judgment, but a kind of flat, weary acknowledgement. He saw her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a few worn coins. Not enough for a bride, not enough for a horse, just enough for a debt. He tossed them onto the porch of the store. They landed with a dull, tinny clatter. "That settles his account," Silas said. His voice was low and raspy, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a dry creek bed. "The rest is for her." He jerked his chin toward the woman. Brant sputtered. "Now hold on. This is my affair. She is my property." "You put a price on her," Silas said, his voice unchanging. "I just paid it." He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. There was a finality in his tone that allowed no argument. He was not making a request. He was closing a ledger. He turned his back on Brant, a dismissal more profound than any blow. He walked to the post. The woman flinched as he drew near, her body tensing for a strike. He did not touch her. He pulled a small, worn pocket knife from his duster. The blade clicked open, a sound that was sharp and clean in the hot, stagnant air. With two swift, efficient motions, he sawed through the coarse rope at her wrists. The fibers parted. The tension was gone. Her hands fell to her sides, numb and useless. Red welts, raw and weeping, circled her wrists. She cradled one hand with the other, a gesture of self-protection so ingrained she did not realize she was doing it. Silas folded the knife and slipped it back into his pocket. He did not offer a hand. He did not speak a word of comfort. He simply stood back, giving her space, and waited. The silence stretched. Brant, for once, was speechless, his face a mottled canvas of fury and humiliation. The few remaining onlookers watched, confused. This was not the expected end to the day's entertainment. The woman looked from Silas's dusty boots up to his shadowed face. She could not read his expression. It was as blank as the sky. She looked at Brant, at the town that had bound her, and then back to the quiet man who had cut her loose. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod toward the road that led out of town, away from the sun-baked buildings and the staring eyes. Then he turned and began to walk. He did not look back to see if she was following. She hesitated for only a heartbeat. Her bare feet were tender on the hot ground. Her body ached with a profound weariness. But she took a step, and then another, leaving the post, the rope, and the man who had tied her there behind in the dust. The journey was a long, silent procession of two. His back was a steady, unmoving landmark ahead of her. The dust his boots kicked up was a fine, pale ghost that she walked through. The sun beat down, relentless. The land stretched out on all sides, a vast, cracked canvas of brown and ochre, broken only by the gray-green of stubborn sagebrush. The wind had a mean streak, whipping strands of her hair across her face, stinging her eyes. He never looked back, but his pace was slow, measured. It was a pace for tired legs and bare feet. He walked as if he had all the time in the world, as if the destination was not a place but merely the end of the day's light. Hours passed. The sun slid down the western sky, painting the clouds in shades of blood orange and bruised purple. Her throat was a desert, her lips cracked. Just when she thought she could not take another step, that she would simply lie down in the dust and let the land reclaim her, he stopped. He shrugged a canteen from his shoulder. He drank, then held it out to her, his arm extended back without turning. His knuckles were chapped, the skin pulled tight over the bone. She took it. Her hands trembled as she lifted the heavy tin to her lips. The water was warm, metallic, but it was the most precious thing she had ever tasted. It sluiced the dust from her throat, a small, cool miracle. She drank until the ache was gone, then handed it back. Their fingers did not touch. He took the canteen, hung it back on his shoulder, and started walking again. It was the first kindness, unspoken, unadorned. It was just water. It was everything. They arrived as dusk was turning the world to shades of deep indigo and charcoal. The house was not a house. It was a cabin, built of sturdy, weathered logs chinked with mud that had long since dried and cracked. It stood alone in a small clearing, looking as if it had grown out of the earth itself. It had the same quiet, enduring, wounded look as the man who lived in it. A small, fenced-in plot next to the cabin held the ghosts of a garden. Beyond that, a single, lonely grave was marked with a simple wooden cross, its surface scoured smooth by wind and time. The air here was different. It was still, heavy with the scent of pine and cold stone. The house seemed to be holding its breath. Silas went to the door and pushed it open. It swung inward with a low groan. He stepped inside, leaving the door ajar for her. He did not invite her in. He simply made it possible for her to enter. She paused on the threshold. The inside was dark, filled with shadows that seemed to pool in the corners. She could make out the shape of a stone hearth, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs. It was a space stripped bare, containing only what was necessary for survival. It was clean, but it was hollow, haunted by an absence she could feel in her bones. He moved through the gloom, his motions sure and familiar. He lit a single lantern on the table. The light bloomed, soft and yellow, pushing the shadows back but not vanquishing them. It revealed the room's sparseness. A bed in one corner, a door leading to another small room. No pictures.
No curtains.
Nothing soft. He gestured toward the table. On it sat a heel of bread and a wedge of hard cheese. Food. An offering. He then pointed toward the closed door of the small second room. "That room is yours," he said. His voice, in the confines of the cabin, sounded like it came from under floorboards, deep and unused. "The door has no lock. I don't lock doors." She understood the unspoken contract. Food, shelter, safety, her own space. He was not a savior. He was a man offering a piece of his solitude. He asked for nothing in return. She had no idea what to do with such a thing. She nodded, a small, jerky movement. She went to the room, her bare feet silent on the worn floorboards. Inside, there was only a narrow cot with a thin mattress and a single folded blanket. A small window looked out onto the darkness and the lonely grave. She closed the door behind her, the soft click of the latch and exhale of a breath she did not know she had been holding. For the first time in a very long time, she was in a room by herself, behind a door she could choose to open. Days settled into a rhythm, marked not by conversation but by shared work and the turning of the sun. The silence in the cabin was a living thing. At first it was heavy, an awkward space between them. But slowly, it softened, becoming a comfortable, shared quiet. It was the silence of 2 people who had no words for what they had endured, and so offered each other the peace of not having to speak. He rose before the sun, the sound of him stoking the fire the first sign of the new day. He would leave a pot of coffee brewing on the hearth and a chunk of bread on the table before heading out to mend the things that always needed mending. A sagging fence line, a loose board on the lean-to, a worn harness strap. She would wake to the smell of wood smoke and coffee. She drank the coffee he left, ate the bread. At first, she stayed in her room, a ghost in his house. Then, one morning, she took the broom from the corner and swept the floor. The soft whisk of the bristles was the only sound. When he came in for his midday meal, he did not say anything, but she saw his eyes flick to the clean-swept floorboards, the tidy hearth. The next day, she washed the few dishes in the basin, scrubbing them with sand and water until they shone. The day after that, she took his torn work shirt from where it lay on a chair and, using a needle and thread she found in a small wooden box, mended the tear with small, neat stitches that were almost invisible. He put the shirt on the next morning without a word, but she saw him run a thumb over the seam. She began to explore the edges of her new life. She tended to the sad, neglected garden, her fingers finding a forgotten familiarity in the cool earth. She pulled weeds, turned the soil. She found a patch of stubborn wildflowers growing near the creek and picked a small, bright blue one. She walked to the lonely grave with the wooden cross and laid the flower at its base. She did not know whose grave it was, but she knew it was a place of sorrow, and that felt like a place she understood. He watched her from a distance. He saw her in the garden, a small, determined figure coaxing life from the dead soil. He saw her place the flower on his wife's grave. He said nothing, but that evening, he left a worn but clean shawl on the chair by her door, a silent acknowledgement of the coming autumn chill. She started humming. It was not a tune, just a low, continuous sound, soft as the buzzing of a bee. It was a sound she had forgotten she could make. It filled the quiet spaces in the cabin, a thread of tentative life weaving itself into the fabric of the silence. One evening, a storm rolled in, the wind turning mean and rattling the windows. Rain came down in hard, driving sheets. The fire in the hearth sputtered and hissed. She was kneading dough for bread, a task she had taken upon herself. The simple, physical work of it was grounding. He sat at the table, sharpening the blade of an axe, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel a counterpoint to the storm's fury. A crack of thunder, loud as a cannon shot, shook the small cabin. She jumped, a sharp gasp escaping her lips. The dough fell from her floured hands onto the floor. She stared at it, her face pale in the firelight. He stopped his work. The scraping ceased. The only sounds were the wind and her own ragged breathing. "It's just thunder," he said, his voice quiet, steady. She didn't look at him. She stared at the wasted dough on the floor. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words thin and frayed. He got up, walked over, and looked down at the lump of dough. "That loaf died in vain," he said. It was not a joke, but it was not an accusation either. It was just a statement, dry as dust. He nudged it with the toe of his boot, then looked at her. Her hands were trembling. "You hurt?" he asked. The question was direct, essential. She shook her head, but a single tear traced a clean path through the flour on her cheek. "I don't like loud noises," she managed, "or small spaces, or doors that lock from the outside." The words tumbled out, unplanned, a small landslide of her fear. He stood there for a long moment, simply absorbing her words. He did not offer comfort or platitudes. He knelt, picked up the ruined dough, and tossed it into the fire. It sizzled and smoked. "There are no locks like that here," he said, his back to her as he stared into the flames. "And the sky is big. Lots of room for noise out there. It can't get in here." She watched his back, the solid, unmoving line of his shoulders. He was not trying to fix her. He was just telling her the facts of the world as they existed in this small, safe place. It was more comforting than any embrace. She took a deep breath. She washed the flour from her hands and started a new batch of dough. The storm raged on outside, but inside the cabin, something had settled. The foundation of trust, laid with unspoken kindnesses, now had its first solid stone. Later that week, he came back from a rare trip to town with a sack of flour and a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. He set the flour by the hearth and pushed the parcel across the table to her. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a pair of sturdy leather boots. They were not new, but they were well made and had been recently oiled. They were small enough to fit her. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a question she could not voice. "Winter's coming," he said, turning away to busy himself with the fire. "Ground gets cold." That night, she cooked a rabbit stew, rich and savory with the few wild herbs she had found by the creek. She served it in 2 bowls. They ate in their usual silence, but it was a silence filled with the warmth of the stew and the soft glow of the fire. As he finished his meal, he looked at the empty bowl. "Good stew," he said. She looked down at her hands, a faint warmth rising in her cheeks. "The bread was a little dry. You didn't complain about mine," he countered, the corner of his mouth twitching in what might have been the ghost of a smile. It was the closest they had ever come to banter. It hung in the air between them, delicate and strange. She found herself smiling, a real, small smile that felt foreign on her face. "You're either the kindest man I've met," she said softly, "or the most foolish." He considered this for a moment, his gaze distant. "Can't I be both?" he asked, his voice low and serious. The moment passed. The silence returned. But it was different now, stitched together with these small, raw threads of connection. The house, once hollow, was slowly beginning to breathe again. The first sign of trouble was a smudge of dust on the horizon, a lazy plume rising against the clear, cold blue of the autumn sky. It was too deliberate for a dust devil, too steady for a lone rider. Silas saw it from the edge of his property, where he was resetting a fence post. He stopped his work, his hand resting on the rough wood, and watched it. His body went still, a stillness that was not calm, but coiled. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. He watched the dust cloud resolve itself into the shapes of 3 riders. They were moving at a confident, unhurried pace, heading directly for his cabin, for his land. He finished setting the post, tamping the earth around it with firm, final thuds. He gathered his tools and walked back to the cabin, his stride unhurried, but his eyes were hard, narrowed against the glare of the sun and the approaching threat. She was on the porch, mending a blanket, her new boots tucked neatly beneath her chair. She saw the riders too. She had seen them moments after he had. Her hands had stopped moving, the needle held mid-stitch. The color drained from her face, leaving it as pale and fragile as a moth's wing. The old fear was back, a cold hand squeezing her heart. Silas walked past her and went into the cabin. He did not say, "Go inside," he did not say, "Hide." He came back out a moment later with his rifle, holding it loosely in one hand, its barrel pointed at the floorboards of the porch. He leaned against the post opposite her, his body a casual, unthreatening line. But the rifle changed the entire composition of the scene. It was a statement, a full stop. They waited. The only sound was the wind whispering through the pines and the distant, rhythmic beat of hooffalls growing steadily louder. The riders reined in at the edge of the cleared yard, just beyond the line of the anemic garden she had been tending. The man in the middle was Brant. He looked different here, away from the town that buffered his ego. The land stripped him of his bluster, revealing the pettiness underneath. He sat his horse with a forced arrogance, his companions flanking him like cheap bookends. Brant's eyes swept the scene. The quiet cabin, the mended fence, Silas leaning on the porch, the rifle held so casually. His gaze finally settled on her. It was a look of pure, possessive fury. He saw the new boots on her feet, the shawl around her shoulders. He saw the way she sat, not cowering, but still. "Silas," Brant called out, his voice thin in the open air. "I've come for what's mine." Silas didn't move. He didn't raise the rifle. "Nothing here is yours, Brant." "The law says different," Brant sneered, gesturing toward her. "I have a bill of sale, a bride contract. She belongs to me. She is my wife, runaway or not." "You put her on a post and walked away," Silas said, his voice flat. "That voids any contract a man of honor might recognize."
Honor.
Brant laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "What do you know of honor? Living out here with your dead wife and your ghosts. This is about property. She is mine. I'm taking her back." He made to dismount. The rifle came up, not quickly, not aggressively. Silas simply raised it until it was resting in the crook of his arm, the barrel now pointing in Brant's general direction. It was a subtle shift, but it stopped Brant cold, 1 foot out of the stirrup. "She's not property," Silas said. The words were quiet, but they carried across the yard with absolute clarity. "And you're not setting foot on this land." Brant's face darkened with rage. He looked at his 2 companions, who shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. They had been hired for intimidation, not a gunfight with a man who looked like he had nothing left to lose. "You can't keep her," Brant spat. "She has to choose. Tell him," he shouted at her, his voice cracking with rage. "Tell this dirt farmer you're coming with me. It's the law." All eyes turned to her. It was the moment she had been dreading her entire life. To be the object fought over, the prize to be claimed. She felt the old impulse to shrink, to disappear, to let the men decide her fate. The blanket slid from her lap onto the porch. She looked at Brant, at his greedy, furious face. She saw the post, the rope, the dust. She saw a lifetime of being a possession. Then she looked at Silas. He was not looking at her. His eyes were locked on Brant, his body a solid, unmoving shield between her and the men in the yard. He was not asking her to choose him. He was giving her the space to choose for herself. He was defending her right to have a voice, even if she chose to never use it. And in that space he gave her, she found it. She stood up. The movement was slow, deliberate. Her hands were clenched into tight fists at her sides. She felt the solid leather of her new boots on the wooden porch, grounding her. She took a step forward, standing beside Silas. Not behind him, beside him. She looked directly at Brant, meeting his enraged gaze without flinching. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her voice, when it came, was clear and steady, colder than the wind.
No.
It was just one word, but it was a word forged in the fire of her past and cooled in the quiet safety of this place. It was the sound of a lock breaking. It was the heaviest thing she had ever lifted, and it set her free. Brant stared, his mouth slightly agape. He had expected tears, pleading, or sullen submission. He had not expected this. This woman was not the one he had tied to a post. His eyes darted from her defiant face to Silas's calm one, to the unwavering barrel of the rifle. He saw the two of them standing there, a unified, unbreachable front. They were not two separate people. They were a single, solid answer. He was a bully, and the first rule of bullies is that they only prey on the weak. He saw no weakness here, only a quiet, unyielding strength he could not comprehend and did not dare to test. With a curse, he swung his leg back over his horse. "This isn't over," he snarled. But the threat was hollow. It was the last gasp of a defeated man. He wrenched his horse's head around and kicked its flanks, galloping away without a backward glance. His two companions, looking relieved, wheeled their own mounts and followed, their retreat kicking up a cloud of dust that mirrored their arrival. She and Silas stood on the porch, watching until the dust settled and the silence of the land returned. The rifle was still in his hand. He slowly lowered it. He did not look at her, but she could feel the tension leaving his shoulders. The air between them was charged, electric with the aftermath of the stand they had made together. He finally turned his head, his gaze meeting hers. There were no words of praise, no grand declarations. There was only a look of profound, quiet respect. He saw her, not as the broken thing he had found, but as the woman who had just stood beside him and faced down her own past. "I was scared," she whispered, the admission a raw and vulnerable thing. "I know," he said. His voice was rough with an emotion he did not name. He reached out, not to touch her, but to pick up the fallen blanket from the porch floor. He folded it carefully and handed it back to her. His fingers brushed hers for the first time. The touch was brief, warm, a spark in the cold air. "You didn't run," he added, his voice barely audible. She took the blanket, her hands steady now. "No," she said, looking out at the empty yard where the riders had been. "I'm home." The word hung in the quiet air between them, a fragile, hopeful thing that had finally found a place to land. In the days that followed the confrontation, the silence in the cabin changed again. It was no longer just comfortable. It was intimate. It was the quiet of a shared victory, a shared future. The unspoken contract of food and shelter had been rewritten into something deeper, something that had no need for words. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the flames painting flickering patterns on the log walls, he looked at her. He had been looking at her for days, as if seeing her for the first time. "I never asked your name," he said. It wasn't an accusation, just a realization, an oversight he needed to correct. She had not thought of her name in months. It was a relic from another life, a word that belonged to the woman tied to the post. She had been nameless here, and in that anonymity, she had started to become someone new. But now he was asking, and she found that she wanted to give it to him. "Lena," she said. He tried the name out, his low voice shaping the sound carefully. Lena, it settled in the small cabin, fitting into the space as if it had always been there. It was not just a name, it was an acknowledgement. A beginning. He said it again, softer this time. Lena. A week later, he rode to town and came back not with supplies, but with a thin, stooped man in a dusty coat, the circuit preacher. Silas and Lena were married on the porch, the same porch where they had made their stand. The preacher's words were sparse, whipped away by the wind almost as soon as they were spoken. There were no flowers, no guests. There was only the vast, silent land as their witness. When the preacher asked Silas for the ring, he produced a simple, narrow band of braided leather he had made himself. It was soft and worn, and it fit her finger perfectly. That night, Lena took the ragged, filthy dress she had arrived in, the one she had kept folded at the bottom of a wooden chest. She carried it outside to the fire pit. Silas followed her, standing a respectful distance away as she stared at the bundle of cloth in her hands. It was the last piece of her old life, the last vestige of the woman without a voice. She tossed it into the flames. The fabric caught quickly, curling, turning black at the edges before erupting into a bright, consuming orange. They watched together as it burned, the smoke rising into the star-dusted sky, carrying away the last of the shame and the pain. The fire did not just destroy, it purified. When only glowing embers remained, a sense of profound peace settled over her. The fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. She turned and found Silas watching her, his face illuminated by the dying glow. In his eyes, she saw the winter finally beginning to thaw. The ghost of his past sorrow was still there, but it was no longer a haunting. It was just a part of him, just as her own scars were now a part of her. Two broken people, stitching their lives together with the raw, strong thread of quiet understanding. She walked to him and, for the first time, initiated a touch. She placed her hand on his chest, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. He covered her hand with his own, his grip warm and sure. The cabin was no longer a hollow, haunted space. It was a home. The floorboards that had once groaned now seemed to sigh with contentment. The windows that had looked out onto a lonely expanse now framed a shared world. The house, like its inhabitants, had learned to breathe again. The final image of them was not one of grand passion, but of deep, abiding peace. They sat together on the porch steps in the evenings, shoulder to shoulder, her head often resting against him. They rarely spoke. They did not need to. They watched the sun set, painting the vast, harsh landscape in strokes of impossible beauty. They listened to the whisper of the wind, no longer a mean sound, but a lullaby. They had found each other in the dust and the silence, and in that silence, they had built a sanctuary, a life, a love story written not in words, but in shared glances, mended shirts, a warm bowl of stew, and the simple, profound courage of standing together against the world. This story, it is not just about a rescue. It is not about a strong man saving a damsel in distress. That is the shallow reading of it, the story the townspeople might tell. No, this story is about the quiet, brutal, and beautiful work of reclamation. It is about the fact that sometimes the deepest wounds are not the visible ones. They are the silences we are forced into, the names we are stripped of, the value others assign to us like a price tag on a piece of meat. And healing is not the act of being fixed by another. It is the act of being given a safe space to find the tools to fix yourself. That cabin, that was not just a shelter. It was a sanctuary. That silence was not an absence of words. It was the presence of peace. Every small gesture, the offered water, the mended shirt, the shared meal, was a stitch pulling two broken pieces of the world together to make something whole. So here is the naming of it. We have all, at some point, been tied to a post. We have all felt the judgment of the crowd, the sting of being defined by our weakest moment. And we all carry a quiet man or a defiant woman inside of us, waiting for the safety to step out of the shadows, waiting for the moment to find our voice, even if it is just to say a single solid word. No or yes or even just our own name, spoken in our own voice. Home is not a place you find on a map. It is a stillness you build with someone else. It is a shared look across a quiet room that says, I see your scars, and I am not afraid. It is the courage to burn the rags of your past and trust that something new and strong is waiting in the ashes. If you are brave enough to stand your ground, if you are quiet enough to listen, you might just find that the harshest landscapes grow the most resilient love.